Hi, everybody. Welcome to our latest webinar. I am Roby Brock. We are glad to have you with us. We hope to teach you a little bit more, help you get a little bit more educated about some things that are happening in cybersecurity. I am joined today by John Burgess of Mainstream Technologies, Daniel Weatherly of Mainstream Technologies, and Jason Lafayette with the Wilson Law Group. Jason, thank you. Daniel, thank you for joining us. John, thank you for being here as well. We're going to talk about ransomware today, and we have set up a little bit of a scenario that we'd love for you to listen to about a particular attack that happened recently, and then we will discuss it as a panel right after this. So Holt, we will pitch to your prowess with technology to fire up the today's ransomware.
The U.S. manufacturing company was alerted in the middle of a Saturday night when their servers stopped reporting into their monitoring tools. A follow-up check into the servers revealed that the environment had been encrypted by ransomware, and there was a screen giving instructions on how to pay the ransom to get the files and logs. In a ransomware situation, the preferable recovery strategy is to restore from a backup. The company had local backups and geographically disparate off-site backups. However, local backups were unavailable because they had been encrypted. The off-site backups were available, but because of the distance and the speed of bandwidth that was available, it was going to take 7 days to transmit the data and get their environment restored. It was Sunday, and they were closed for the weekend, but had operations staff planning to show up Monday morning. They were facing at least 1 week of downtime and lost production to restore from backup. What do they do?
A good question. What do they do? So our panel will dive into that. Daniel, let's start with you first. Just kind of, can you explain how the attackers got in?
Sure. For this company, they actually had one of their staff having 2 locations to work from, one at the office, and they had another house they had bought somewhere else in the state. So they wanted to have that remote access, which, we're very familiar with now with COVID-19, but before this, it was a newer thing. So they opened up remote desktop to this user so they could get in from home in this other location. Some people might call that a terminal server. So they're able to get in from wherever they happen to be in the world and log into that server, get a desktop like it's at that location in the factory, and work from anywhere. So they opened that up. They did not restrict it to who could get in. And in this case, the IT admin had created a account called test user because he was testing some software, and he gave it admin rights on the network. And with this exposure of RDP, the hackers were able to brute force or test logins, and they discovered this test user account with a very simple and weak password, and thus were able to log into the network as an administrator, which gave them the ability to go anywhere in the network and do anything they wanted. So that's how that started.
All right. Jason, a question for you on this is kind of what was the ransom proposed? And I mean, and maybe how this works a little bit more generically too. There's a dollar amount. I guess for someone that's never been held for ransom like this before, what is the threat? What are they actually asking for?
In almost all scenarios, they're asking for money. The range of dollar amount has just increased over the years because they realize that they can get more money. Sometimes it depends on if it's an individual, if it's a business. The kind of business that you have often determines the value of the data. And if the hackers were in there long enough, they may have been able to prevent some of your other methods of recovery. So they'll also kind of have an idea of how vulnerable you are to what they're asking for. So typically it's a large sum of money, and often it's in Bitcoin or other denominations so they can prevent tracing.
Does it just pop up on the screen? Hey, we're holding you ransom. Does it come in the form of an email? I mean, how does somebody become aware that they're being held for ransom?
There's a couple ways. It really depends on how the ransomware works. So you can get an email. but often the file itself will have some information, or you'll see notepad files or something like that alongside it that kind of gives you an idea of what they're asking for, how to contact them, things like that.
Yeah, and in this case, there was actually the screen of the machines that were encrypted had a message on them. So the machine would boot up, this message would pop up when you couldn't do anything on the machine other than read this message. And it said, your files have been encrypted. Please transfer this amount of money, thousands of dollars, into this Bitcoin account. And in this case, they also provided an email address for communication. So that's how they knew.
John, to you. So how does someone initially respond to that? How does the chief technology officer for a company, chief information officer for a company, or CEO of a company, when they realize they've been compromised like this, kind of what's a natural reaction to that? And then maybe what's the preferred reaction to that?
Well, the initial response, I mean, you're talking about two different things. You're talking about response and recovery. The initial response, is typically, okay, how do we contain the effects of this? So if we've caught it while it's happening, is there a way that we can turn off machines or unplug machines that have not been affected yet to kind of spread the contagion, or to stop the contagion from spreading throughout the system? But then you have to start evaluating, asking questions, where are our backups? Do we have our backups? Can we, how do we recover from this? Once we're sure that we've stopped the spread of it throughout the your response takes, we got to stop the spread. We have to figure out how they got in, and make sure that we close that hole before we start putting things back together, or they'll just re-ransom you. So stop the spread, identify the source and close the source, and then start figuring out what your recovery options are in terms of, do we have backups to restore from? Are we faced with possibly having to consider paying the ransom? What other options do we have to restore service, or are we looking at starting over from scratch, which is the absolute worst case scenario, but it is a possible option.
I want to stay on this topic here before we get to ways to prevent and things to do to mitigate. You mentioned, should we pay the ransom? This is a question I want all three of you guys to answer. Should you pay the ransom, number one? And number two, does that stop it from happening again? Jason, I'll let you go first.
Should you pay the ransom is a good question. I want to add to that. Are you allowed to pay the ransom? Depending on where it's from, I mean, the U.S. government does have laws on what you can do as far as enabling paying the ransom. Your insurance, if you have cybersecurity insurance, also may have a policy that you may have to follow as far as how you deal with ransomware. So you may have some things other than just, do I need my data? You may have external factors that, help you decide what you can do or can't do. After that, it just depends on the value. You're going to have to add a dollar amount to, is the data I have that they've tied up important enough to pay the ransom? Then you have to think about the whole thought of enabling, and you've got to have a company stance. So that's going to be a kind of a culture decision for your firm as well. So there's a lot of factors other than, do I just monetarily need to assign money to this problem?
Same question to you, Daniel, and have you worked with some people that have paid it?
I do know some people who have paid. I know some people who haven't through acquaintances. But should you pay? For me, it depends. It's really a business decision. Can your business survive without paying it would be the big ultimate question for me. But in addition, what's happened is people not paying has led to the ransomers also taking your data and offering it for sale on the internet if you don't pay. So not only are they holding your systems hostage, but they're threatening to share your data with other people on the internet if you don't pay. So that's led to, pushing more people to have to pay to prevent that from happening.
John, what's your take on this?
Well, very much it's the ransomers and as Jason mentioned, sometimes you're under regulations or external requirements that are impacting this decision, but they really put you in a hard place if you're the victim. Just last week, the Treasury Department issued some guidelines, some guidance that said that if the people who caused perpetrated your ransom attack, if they are on the Treasury Department's list of sanctioned individuals around the world, then the Treasury Department made it clear that, by anybody who pays a ransom to someone that's on that list, or anyone who facilitates the payment. So if it's a possibly an insurance company, that whereas paying the ransom might be an option, the U.S. government is threatening to take action against you if one of the ransomers that you pay is on this list of sanctioned individuals. Through forensics and through coordinated law enforcement, they've identified several people that have written and run these ransom operations around the world, and they've named them as international outlaws. So, but because of that, the government's trying to obviously starve them of funds and make them go to ground. But that puts the victim in a hard place in terms of trying to decide, okay, do I take the what may be the only option I have to kind of restore operations as they were before the attack, versus do I get in a bad situation by enabling, as Jason termed it, some bad behavior.
I want to stay just one more question in kind of this silo right here. I mean, obviously it's successful enough that it keeps them doing it. So there is that. But in your experiences as a whole, have you seen this getting progressively worse, or are the law enforcement mechanisms and the sanctions and the things that John talked about, are those things starting to have an effect in making this more discouraging for ransomware folks?
I'll go ahead and take that first.
Go ahead, Daniel.
In my opinion, what I've seen through 2020, it is getting worse, as well as the dollar amounts are getting much larger. So with that, even if 1 in 100 pays the ransom, they're making a lot of money. So, in my opinion, it is getting worse.
Yeah, John or Jason?
Go ahead, Jason.
I think people are becoming more informed. IT departments are becoming more informed. Managed service providers are more informed. However, I think their customer base is getting larger. More and more people are getting on the internet. More and more people are putting devices online. More and more people have secondary, third devices. They're giving old computers to their kids. They're doing different things like that. Everybody working from home, people rushed out to grab all the computers in their short supplies and all these different things. Some of those might be used for business. They might be used for family. But not all of those devices could people who previously weren't online know all the protocols and procedures they need to take to stay safe. And so you just have more points of access. So people are becoming more informed, but there's more customers out there. So I think, like Daniel said, that it's just becoming more widespread just because of options.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think there is a growing awareness among businesses and government organizations. And so the ones who recognize the threat and are prepared for it have the tools in place and the policies in place to prevent it from happening, are largely unaffected by this. So kind of what Jason talked about, that there's a growing audience or a growing target pool with everybody going remote and getting online with possibly unhardened systems. Then that also turns into, they've got a bigger target pool, and they are not as successful in possibly the businesses who would be the more lucrative targets. So as Daniel mentioned, the ransom amounts are going up because they found that, it's so successful that we could make a lot more money if we were asking more than $2,000. So if we go to $10,000, we're making, more money. Our more lucrative targets aren't as available as they were, but we have a much more lower value targets. But we've demonstrated that we can get more money out of them. So there's two factors there. It's a growing target pool, and just the economics of ransomware have caused the ransoms to go up.
Okay, so that's more of a macro picture. Let's drill down into a micro picture here, really talk about it from a company perspective in terms of how can a ransomware attack be prevented? Daniel, I'll start with you. What are some things that should be in place for a company to prevent holes in their system, to provide backup and things like that?
Yeah, so the first thing, looking at how ransomware starts, in this case, it started from an internet-facing server. So making sure that all of your exposure to the internet that allows inbound access, whether it's email, remote desktop like this one, VPN, those types of things are all secured with multi-factor authentication. That's where you have your username and password. And then one other thing that changes constantly that you have with you, like a number token. That stops them cold from being able to brute force their way in most cases. The other is they get in through phishing emails or sending emails to people where they click on links, in which case your best defense is user awareness training, making sure that people are more vigilant when they're in their email, paying attention to emails that may not be business related. Why don't you just delete those, for example? And then when you have links in emails, making sure they hover over the link, see where it goes. Don't click on links in your work email on your cell phone, that type of thing. So those are the easier, biggest bang for the buck ways to prevent ransomware. But there are others that Jason may chime in on some of those.
Yeah, go for it, Jason.
Kind of piggybacking off what Daniel was saying, intentional behavior. It's not just your awareness training for your staff and your vendors and your partners, because they need to be at the same level as you. It's going to be with your IT staff or partners to make sure that they're being diligent. It's not set it and forget it. It's taking the approach of deny all, allow only what you need as you need it. Having really good procedures in place, testing those procedures, revisiting those procedures often, getting other opinions on your procedures. IT changes or technology changes so frequently that you might think that you're great today, but if you're not staying on top of what's happening tomorrow, it doesn't matter anymore. So you really have to be intentional about your patching, your protocols, your procedures, not just people protocols, but the protocols that are on your hardware, on your systems. So it's really having an intentional or creating an intentional behavior or culture that we're going to attack this. We're going to do the best defense that we can to kind of prevent these things from happening, because oftentimes if things are too difficult, they'll move on to easier prey. So they'll kind of leave you be, but you've got to be able to withstand really, really brute force attacks that take a while. And you need to have systems that let you know, hey, I'm being attacked. What do I need to proactively do about this? Not find out about it 6 months later. So there's a lot of things you have to do.
Yeah, so I hear Daniel and Jason talking about kind of constructing an approach that leaves you as few holes or vulnerabilities as possible. And it sounds like a lot of constant monitoring. John, I'd like you to maybe speak a little bit more in this particular instance, and I think it'll be generic here, is this backup process. They had backup servers. It just was going to take 7 days-ish to get what they needed off of those backup servers. Is that acceptable, number one? Is there a way to have a backup system in a way that doesn't allow that much downtime and allows you to avoid this ransomware situation?
Well, I think the backups were in my mind, were designed to meet a certain set of risks. So this company had they had backups, like you said. That's a great thing, and those backups probably would have done them great in the event that they lost a single machine, or maybe if they had a fire at the facility and needed to restore those systems somewhere off-site. So that's kind of the traditional use of backups, is how do I recover from a system failure or the loss of a facility? Well, in this case, an additional risk that needs to be considered in your backup strategy is can you reach my backups from the local system? We call that air gap. Is there an air gap so that there's no connection between my backup and my running system? And in this case, there was no air gap. So when the attackers got in, part of everything that they were encrypting was the local backups. So they had these off-site backups that were, those were the real disaster recovery backups. And those were the ones that were just because of bandwidth and network constraints, we're going to take 7 days to restore, off of. So in your risk, from a management standpoint, from the business standpoint, as you're evaluating your risks, fire is always up there. Loss of a facility is always up there. But what needs to get on that list are things like ransomware attacks and things that would compromise what would be otherwise a very reasonable backup strategy.
Something I'd like to.
Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Something I'd like to add to that is I also think there was a failure to do a proper assessment of their data. So we spoke earlier about the value. If you have data that's that critical, it's just not nightly, weekly backups or snapshots. There's other things that you could do throughout the day to give you additional backup points. So there's the way that you back up and the frequency in which you back up, not just the traditional a couple times a week, once a month, and then store that where, for all intentional purposes, you don't have access to it in the speed that you need it. They need to do a better assessment of the value of your data and the value or the expense of not having access to your data.
Absolutely.
I learned a new word today, air gap. That's awesome. You know, anytime I can learn something new, it's good to do this. All right, who can tell me how this particular incident that we profiled here, we obviously kept them anonymous, how did it play out? What was the final outcome of all of this?
I can take that. So when management was faced with this 7-day loss of operations, you know, really, we have our factory is going to be shut down for a week. Just that loss of revenue, you know, it's a big number out there. This attack was from 4 or 5 years ago. So the ransoms, you know, this ransom in this case was only like $2,000. So the management made the decision to take a chance on paying the ransom. And if they took the ransom and didn't unlock the files, then okay, it was a reasonable bet to make. The next problem that came up was that the ransomers wanted the money in Bitcoin. And again, this is 4 or 5 years ago, so the Bitcoin community was not nearly as robust. You know, the cryptocurrency market wasn't nearly as robust, and no one in the scenario had the ability to purchase directly any Bitcoin to transfer to these people. So that turned into, okay, we start searching and Googling. We find somebody on the internet in Russia who represents that they will, in return for a wire transfer of US dollars, will sell, you know, $2,000 worth of Bitcoin. So again, here's another bet that, okay, we're going to trust someone on the internet who we've not met to be an honest business person. But again, it's still part of we're racing against the clock trying to get the systems up. So the decision was made to take a chance. Money was wired to this anonymous address in Russia. Within 30 minutes, that quantity of Bitcoin had been deposited in an account. And within 30 minutes of transferring that to the ransom wallet, the unlock codes were provided and the systems had begun unencrypting. So in this case, you know, paying the ransom paid off. It was obvious, you know, it was obviously a gamble, a very risky gamble. It had no, you know, the odds were that it was not going to pay off, and the victim ended up being open for business, you know, just in the nick of time on that Monday morning.
Yeah. Wow.
Very lucky. They got tremendously lucky.
That sounds like it. All right. Closing comments from anyone. We are running up against our time limit here. So anybody want to throw in anything we haven't talked about yet? The proverbial, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to make a point of? Daniel.
Yeah, I just want to mention, we didn't talk about password strength. This happened because of a very weak password. And you can enforce policies on your network to require longer passwords, complex passwords. And just to let you know, a group called Ars Technica a year ago did a cracking test on 16,000 passwords between 6 and 16 characters and cracked 90% of them within an hour using cloud technologies. So it used to be you run cracking on a machine locally. Now you can actually go buy computing power from, you know, Amazon or Microsoft or whoever and run cracks in the cloud. And they're much more efficient. So strong passwords. We hadn't talked about that. Definitely need to make that one of the recommendations.
All right, Jason, you want to anything to add?
Yeah, I'm going to say two-factor authentication is going to be another thing. And something else that we need to add, I don't know that we necessarily call it geolocation, but we're going to put just IP addresses. So one is restricting who has access to your network. And I believe in this story, they said that the person had a second location or second home, et cetera. They could have locked down that port so that only that IP address could have connected. So that would have been extra. If you add the two-factor authentication, that would have been something. So it's something you have versus something you know. There's so many failures in this. The thing is, it's behavior of your staff. It's taking an approach that security is real. You really have to do something about it. They are trying. Stop thinking that it's not going to happen to me. It's going to happen to someone. If you just think about all the lists where they're talking about password compromises from Home Depot to other companies or whatnot, your information might be in there. That might be the opening that they're going for, and they might be going down a list, and eventually they'll get to yours. So what are you doing about it? So be intentional in your behavior.
All right, John, I give you the second to last word because I'm getting the last word.
Okay. Like we mentioned last week, developing a culture of security in your company. This what Daniel and Jason just talked about regarding this remote user, would have posed an inconvenience on this user possibly in their remote work. The password's too hard to remember. I have to remember this second factor. I have to carry this fob or whatever. But it's about the inconvenience, the trivial inconvenience associated with what the potential loss was for this event. So starting with leadership and permeating through the company, we need to understand that we are all targets in this cyber war, and we need to start acting, as Jason said repeatedly, intentionally about this. As we're going through and we're doing risk assessments on our business, like I mentioned earlier, everybody knows how to plan for a fire. Everybody knows how to plan for something happening to my building. And part of this culture of security is we need to add these cyber threats as real, extinction level risks to our business if the wrong thing happens, from the wrong attacker. So just start thinking about these things like you would a fire or a personal emergency or something. Just elevate the discourse in your company about these events.
All right, John Burgess and Daniel Weatherly with Mainstream Technologies, Jason Lafayette with the Wilson Law Group. Thank you all for your insight. Very informative, very educational. For everybody that's watching this, we are here every Thursday at 10 a.m. during the month of October for this webinar series on great failures in cybersecurity. And so next week, we're going to be looking at the big Equifax breach, I believe is what's on our topic. So tune in for that and some lessons learned and some lessons of prevention to be instituted. I'm Roby Brock with Talk Business and Politics. Again, thanks to our panel. Thank you for watching. And that concludes this webinar.